What if everything you owned vanished overnight? Would you crumble under the weight of loss, or discover freedom in having nothing left to cling to? This is the story of one man's painful fall from materialism into the quiet strength of Stoicism and the clarity of minimalism. Adrian Cole was the kind of man people noticed when he entered a room. His watch, a polished Swiss masterpiece that cost more than most people's yearly rent, caught the light first. Then came the sharp tailoring of his Italian suit, the confident stride, and the way his phone never left his hand, buzzing with emails, messages, and stock alerts. He was a man who built his identity from what he owned, and he owned plenty. His apartment sat at the top floor of a glass tower in the heart of the city. From his window, the skyline stretched out like a monument to ambition. Steel, glass, and neon stacked to the heavens. Inside, every inch was curated. Leather furniture imported from Spain, rugs woven in Morocco, art pieces purchased at auction. Even the kitchen appliances were chosen for their prestige rather than their use. Adrian barely cooked, but he liked how the brushed steel refrigerator gleamed when guests came over. He worked for a private equity firm that rewarded excess. Success was measured by cars, vacations, and the brand of champagne you ordered at rooftop bars. Adrian fit right in. He had 3 cars, though he only drove one, and a walk-in closet that looked like a boutique. Shoes in neat rows, ties still wrapped in plastic, cufflinks in boxes he'd never opened. But beneath the gloss, something restless gnawed at him. He woke up earlier and earlier, driven by the fear that someone else was catching up. When he lay in bed at night, he felt not satisfaction, but annoying emptiness. He silenced it with purchases, the newest phone, a rare bottle of whiskey, another suit. Yet the hunger always returned. One Thursday evening, Adrian hosted a gathering. Colleagues, a few clients, and some acquaintances filled the apartment. Music pulsed low, glasses clinked, and the city lights painted the room in gold and silver. Adrian moved among his guests, offering wine and casually mentioning the value of his newest painting. He was used to the polite nods, the envy that flashed across faces when they saw his collection. But that night, one guest didn't react as expected. He was a quiet man, a guest of a guest named Daniel. Dressed plainly in a dark shirt and worn shoes, he looked out of place among the designer suits. When Adrian offered him a drink and gestured toward the view, Daniel smiled politely but said nothing about the view, nothing about the apartment. Instead, he asked, "Does owning all this make you happy?" The question cut sharper than intended. Adrian laughed it off, but the sound felt hollow even to himself. "Of course," he said, swirling his wine. "Look around." Daniel tilted his head. "I am. I just wonder, does it bring peace or just distraction?" Adrian opened his mouth, then shut it. Nobody asked him things like that. Not here, not in his world. Guests usually asked how much the painting cost or where he got the wine. Nobody questioned the foundation of it all. The moment passed quickly. Another colleague pulled Adrian into conversation, and Daniel melted into the background. But the question lingered. That night, when the guests were gone and the apartment was silent, Adrian sat in his leather chair, staring at the city below. He tried to shake off the thought, but the words echoed, peace or just distraction. He poured another glass of wine, though he wasn't thirsty. He ordered a new pair of headphones online before bed, just to remind himself that he could. A week later, everything changed. It was late evening when he returned home from work. He had stayed longer than usual, chasing a deal, his mind buzzing with numbers. As he stepped into the building lobby, the faint smell of smoke hit his nose.
By the time he reached the 34th floor, alarms were wailing. His apartment was a haze of smoke and flashing lights. Firefighters swarmed, shouting orders. Someone pulled him back before he could rush inside. He stood in the hallway, coughing, watching as black smoke poured from his doorway. His possessions, paintings, suits, furniture, his carefully curated life were swallowed by flames. Sprinklers hissed, water pooled on the floor, and the crack of breaking glass echoed like gunshots. By midnight, it was over. Adrian, the man who once owned everything, found himself with nothing but a phone in his pocket and a credit card that couldn't replace the photographs, the heirlooms, the illusion of control. That night, he slept on a borrowed couch in a friend's spare room. The leather chair, the suits, the art, all gone. For the first time in years, his surroundings were bare. He thought of Daniel's question again, and this time it struck deeper. Peace, or just distraction? The silence of the empty room gave him no answer. But soon he would meet Daniel again, and this time he would listen.
Adrian woke with a start. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling above him was low, off-white, with a faint crack running diagonally across it. The air smelled faintly of detergent and old carpet. Then he remembered. He wasn't in his apartment. His apartment was gone. He sat up on the couch, his back aching from the awkward sleep. The blanket someone had tossed over him was thin, scratchy. Around him, the small living room of his friend Mark's apartment was cluttered with coffee mugs, unopened mail, and a stack of takeout boxes. Adrian rubbed his face with both hands and exhaled. He had barely slept. Images of the fire kept replaying in his mind. The flames clawing at his furniture, the crack of glass, the feeling of helplessness as he watched everything he'd built vanish in smoke. Mark shuffled in from the kitchen, hair messy, wearing sweatpants. "Morning," he muttered. "Coffee?" "Yeah," Adrian said, his voice hoarse. Mark poured him a mug, set it on the coffee table, then sat down in the recliner across from him. "Rough night, huh?" "That's one way to put it." They sat in silence for a moment. The TV played softly in the background, a morning show host chirping about the weather. Adrian stared into his coffee, feeling the bitterness cut through the fog in his head. "You'll get through this," Mark said finally. "Insurance will pay out. You'll be back on your feet in no time." Adrian nodded, though the words landed shallow. He wasn't worried about money. He had plenty. But money couldn't bring back the things he'd lost. The sense of identity, the comfort of walking into a space that reflected who he thought he was. Without that, he felt naked. That day at work, people treated him differently. Colleagues who normally competed with him softened their tones, offered pitying looks. His assistant asked 3 times if he was sure he was okay to be in the office. Adrian forced a smile and brushed them off. The last thing he wanted was sympathy. But he also didn't want to go back to Mark's cramped apartment. That evening, he checked into a luxury hotel. The suite was sleek, modern, with a view of the river. The moment he stepped in, a small wave of relief washed over him. This was closer to normal. Fresh sheets, marble bathroom, space that smelled like wealth. He poured himself a drink from the minibar and told himself he'd be fine. Except he wasn't. Days turned into weeks. The fire investigation dragged on. The insurance company stalled. His firm put him on lighter duties to recover, which only made him feel useless. Each night he returned to the hotel, but instead of comfort, the expensive suite began to feel like a cage. The walls were sterile, the art generic, the view impersonal. He missed his own space, the curated collection that had made him feel in control. He started drinking more. 1 glass of scotch turned into 3, then 4. Some nights he stumbled into bed after midnight, waking late and rushing to the office. Other nights he scrolled endlessly on shopping sites,
adding things to his cart, watches, shoes, gadgets, only to close the app before buying. What was the point of buying if he had no place to put them? His friends stopped inviting him out after he canceled too many dinners. He claimed he was rebuilding, but in truth, he was sinking. One evening as he walked out of the office, he saw a familiar figure waiting near the lobby. It was Daniel, the quiet man from his party, the one who had asked the question Adrian couldn't shake. "Adrian," Daniel said, smiling gently, "I heard about the fire. I'm sorry." Adrian blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Word travels," Daniel said. "I know one of your colleagues." They stood awkwardly for a moment, the busy street humming around them. Finally, Daniel asked, "Have you eaten dinner?" Adrian almost refused. He wanted to go back to the hotel, pour a drink, and drown the day. But something in Daniel's calm expression made him pause. Against his instincts, he nodded. They went to a small diner a few blocks away. No valet, no chandeliers, no rare wine, just cracked vinyl booths, laminated menus, and a stack of takeout boxes. Adrian sat stiffly, out of place, but Daniel seemed perfectly at ease. As they ate, Daniel asked simple questions: how Adrian was sleeping, how he was coping. Adrian, perhaps loosened by exhaustion, answered honestly for the first time in weeks. "I feel like I've lost myself," he admitted, pushing his food around. "I don't even know who I am without my things. Without that apartment, I feel empty." "I understand," Daniel said. "But let me ask you, were you any less you the night before the fire than you were the night after?" Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. You went to bed in your apartment, surrounded by possessions. The next day, they were gone. But you woke up the same man. So what really changed?" Everything changed. My life changed." Daniel sipped his water. "No, only your circumstances changed. You are still you. The fire stripped away your things, but it didn't take your mind, your choices, your character, unless you let it." The words sat heavy. Adrian wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't. Something about Daniel's calm certainty disarmed him. "You sound like some kind of philosopher," Adrian muttered. "Not exactly, but I do read the Stoics. They teach that possessions, status, even health, these are external. They come and go. What matters is how we respond. No one can take that from you unless you hand it over." Adrian scoffed, though half-heartedly. "Easy for you to say. You didn't lose everything." Daniel tilted his head. "Haven't I? Everyone loses things, Adrian. I've lost plenty. But loss is a teacher. It shows us what we really need, what's truly ours." Adrian looked down at his plate, unable to meet Daniel's eyes. He wanted to dismiss the conversation, to laugh it off as abstract nonsense. But deep down, he knew Daniel was right about one thing. His reaction to the fire had been consuming him more than the fire itself. They finished dinner in silence. When they parted ways, Daniel left him with a final thought. "Don't let your possessions own you, Adrian. You'll only suffer twice. Once when you fear losing them, and again when you do." That night, Adrian lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. Daniel's words echoed louder than the sirens in his memory. For the first time, Adrian wondered if the fire had destroyed more than his belongings. Maybe it had revealed something he didn't want to see. The truth was simple, brutal, and undeniable. He had built his identity on things that could burn. And now, standing in the ashes, he was left with nothing but himself. A self he hardly knew. Adrian returned to the hotel after his dinner with Daniel, the city lights stretching like veins of fire across the skyline. Normally, that view would have filled him with pride. Tonight, it felt hollow, like staring at a photograph of a party you weren't invited to. He threw his jacket across the chair and collapsed on the bed. Daniel's words echoed. You'll only suffer twice, once when you fear losing them, and again when you do. Adrian hated how they stuck. He wanted to dismiss them, but they wormed under his skin, lodging deeper with each hour. He poured a drink, then another. The scotch burned, but it didn't silence the echo. By morning, he was groggy, late for work, and irritated. At the office, he threw himself into his tasks, trying to outrun the thought. He snapped at his assistant. He glared at a junior analyst who presented a shaky report. Colleagues whispered in the hallway when they thought he couldn't hear. Adrian knew the look. They smelled weakness. At lunch, he ducked into the company gym, thinking sweat might silence his head. But as he ran on the treadmill, staring at his reflection in the mirror, the cracks appeared. The man looking back at him didn't look in control. His eyes were tired, his jaw clenched too tightly. He saw not power, but desperation. He slowed the treadmill, panting, and turned away from the mirror. That evening back at the hotel, he opened his laptop and scrolled through photos he'd salvaged from his phone. Images of his apartment, the grand rug, the leather couch, the painting above the mantel. He stared at them like a grieving parent, as though staring long enough might bring them back. But the longer he looked, the more absurd it seemed. The rug he had barely walked on, always afraid of staining it. The couch, he rarely sat on it, preferring the chair. The painting, he couldn't even remember the artist's name, though he had spent a small fortune on it just to impress clients. His throat tightened. Was that all it had been? A stage set? The thought gnawed at him, and for the first time, Adrian felt shame, not just loss. Shame at how empty it all looked when stripped of context. He slammed the laptop shut and poured another drink. 2 weeks later, the insurance call came. The agent's tone was measured, bureaucratic. The claim would take significant time to process. Some items weren't covered fully, others not at all. They needed detailed inventories, receipts, appraisals. Adrian promised he'd provide them, but after hanging up, he realized he didn't even know where to begin. Receipts, appraisals. Most of it had been impulse purchases, trophies from his constant chase for more. The realization left him stunned. For years, he had told himself he was building a collection, curating a life. But now, stripped bare, he saw it for what it was, a pile of expensive distractions with no story, no soul. And he couldn't stop thinking of Daniel. Were you any less you the night before the fire than the night after? Adrian wanted to believe yes. He wanted to believe his things made him, but the question lingered like smoke in the air. You couldn't escape it by opening a window. That weekend, Mark invited him to a party. "Might be good for you," Mark said. "Get your mind off things." Adrian agreed. The party was at a penthouse downtown, all glass and chrome, filled with laughter, champagne, and music that thumped in his chest. It should have felt like home. But as he moved through the crowd, glass in hand, he felt like an imposter. Conversations swirled about vacations, watches, cars, exactly the conversations he once dominated. Yet now, every word sounded thin, like air leaking from a balloon. One guest, a woman in a sparkling dress, asked him casually, "So, Adrian, where are you living these days?" The question hit like a slap. He stammered something about temporary arrangements, but her smile froze politely and she turned to someone else. For the rest of the night, he felt their eyes on him, curious, pitying, maybe even gloating. He left early, walking alone down the cold street, the city's neon burning above him. For the first time, he wondered, had he ever truly belonged in that world? Or had he simply been renting his way into it, dressing the costume until the costume burned away? Back at the hotel, he didn't drink. Instead, he sat in the silence, staring out the window. His phone buzzed, a text from Daniel. "Still up?" Adrian hesitated, then typed back, "Yeah." A few minutes later, Daniel called. I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up? Adrian exhaled. Depends on the hour. That's normal. Daniel, Adrian's voice caught. What if I don't know who I am without all of it? There was a pause. Then Daniel said, then maybe it's time to find out. That night, Adrian didn't sleep well. But in the restless dark, a thought emerged. Quiet, dangerous, but persistent. Maybe the fire wasn't just an ending. Maybe it was an invitation.
Daniel suggested they meet at a park on Saturday morning. Adrian almost canceled twice. He wasn't a park kind of man. His Saturdays were usually reserved for expensive brunches, shopping trips, or the gym. Sitting on a bench in the open air felt unproductive. But something about Daniel's calm persistence pulled him in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the faint hope that Daniel's strange sense of peace might rub off on him. The park was alive with weekend energy, kids chasing soccer balls, couples walking hand in hand, joggers pounding the path. Daniel sat on a bench beneath a wide oak tree, sipping coffee from a paper cup. His clothes were simple again, plain shirt, faded jeans, shoes worn at the edges. He looked as if he owned nothing valuable, and yet he sat like a man who owned the whole morning. "You came," Daniel said warmly as Adrian approached. "Barely," Adrian muttered, sitting down beside him. Daniel smiled, but didn't press. For a while, they just watched the park unfold. Adrian fidgeted, checking his phone twice before shoving it back into his pocket. Finally, Daniel asked, "How are you, really?" Adrian exhaled. "Angry. Restless. I feel like my life got ripped out from under me, and I don't know how to live without it." Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe you. But I wonder, do you really mean your life or your possessions?" "They were my life," Adrian snapped. "I worked for them. I built everything I had." Daniel turned, his gaze steady but kind. Epictetus once said, "When you are delighted with anything, be prepared to lose it. When you kiss your child, remind yourself he may die tomorrow. When you hold your cup, remind yourself it may break." Adrian frowned. "That's grim." "It's honest," Daniel said. The Stoics taught that everything outside our control is temporary. Our wealth, our health, our friends, even our families. If we pin our peace on things we can't control, we'll suffer the moment they're taken away. And they will be taken away, sooner or later. Adrian looked out across the park, where a boy tripped and fell, then laughed as he sprang back up. His mother brushed him off with ease, unconcerned by the fall. "So, what?" Adrian asked, his voice sharp. "We just stop caring about anything? Become emotionless?" "No," Daniel said softly. "We care deeply, but wisely. We don't chain our happiness to what fortune can give or take. We care about what is truly ours, our choices, our actions, the way we live in this moment. That's where our freedom lies." Adrian shook his head. "Sounds nice on paper, but in real life, people need things. I needed that apartment, those clothes, that status. Without them, I feel invisible." Daniel considered this, then asked, "Invisible to who?" Adrian blinked. "What? Who are you trying to be seen by? Your colleagues? Strangers at parties? Yourself?" Adrian didn't answer. Seneca wrote that poverty isn't having too little, but wanting more.
The rich man who always wants more is poorer than the beggar who is content with his bread." "That's easy for him to say," Adrian muttered. "He was rich." Daniel chuckled. "Yes, and he knew firsthand how wealth can own us if we're not careful. He warned against it because he lived it." They sat in silence again. A breeze rustled the oak leaves above them. Adrian stared at the ground, running his thumb across the seam of his trousers. "Daniel," he said finally, "do you really believe this? That peace doesn't come from things?" Daniel turned his face toward the sky. "I don't just believe it, I've lived it. When I lost my father, I thought my world had ended, but I realized that grief was sharpened by how tightly I clung to the illusion that I could control how long he'd be with me. The Stoics taught me to accept his death as part of life. It didn't erase the pain, but it freed me from drowning in it." Adrian's throat tightened. "I don't know if I could do that." Daniel placed his coffee cup on the bench beside him. "You don't have to be ready all at once. It's like lifting weights. You don't start with the heaviest bar. You build strength day by day. Stoicism is practice, not perfection." Adrian leaned back against the bench, eyes closed. The words made sense in theory, but he couldn't see himself living that way. Not yet. Still, there was something in Daniel's calm presence that unsettled him, like standing near a still lake and realizing how noisy your own mind is. As the sun began to dip, Daniel stood up. "Walk with me," he said. They strolled the path, their steps unhurried. "Adrian," Daniel said, "the fire didn't ruin your life. It revealed it. You were building your peace on sand. Now you have a chance to build on rock." Adrian's jaw clenched. He wanted to resist, to reject the lesson. But the truth was, part of him hoped Daniel was right, that there could be something solid beneath the rubble. And though he couldn't admit it yet, a seed had been planted. That night, when Adrian returned to his hotel room, he didn't pour a drink. Instead, he sat in the silence, remembering Daniel's words. He felt restless, raw, exposed. But for the first time since the fire, he also felt something else. Possibility.
Adrian woke the next morning, determined to prove Daniel wrong. Stoicism might have sounded neat in a park on a sunny Saturday, but Adrian wasn't about to let some ancient philosophy convince him that losing everything was no big deal. That was a loser's mindset, he told himself. He hadn't built his career by surrendering to fate. He built it by taking control, by bending circumstances to his will. So he got out of bed, shaved carefully, and dressed in one of the few suits he had salvaged from the dry cleaners. It didn't matter that it was old. He pressed it crisp, tied his silk tie tight, and walked into the office like nothing had changed. People noticed. He could feel their eyes on him, scanning for cracks. He smiled wider, laughed louder, worked harder. By noon, he was firing off emails with such speed that his assistant flinched when he called her name. When a colleague asked casually if he'd heard anything from the insurance company, Adrian snapped, "Of course I have. Everything's under control." The colleague raised an eyebrow, said nothing, and walked away. Adrian's chest burned. They think I'm weak. They think I'm finished. At lunch, he called the insurance adjuster himself, demanding updates, threatening lawsuits, throwing his voice into the harsh bark he reserved for negotiation. The woman on the other end listened politely, repeated the same measured phrases, and ended the call with a flat, "We'll be in touch." Adrian slammed the phone on his desk. His pulse raced, his jaw ached from clenching. That night, back at the hotel, he didn't want silence. He blasted music,
poured whiskey, and scrolled through luxury websites, filling carts with suits, watches, gadgets. He imagined himself walking into the office draped in newness, showing everyone he was still the man who had it all. But his finger hovered over the checkout button, and he froze. Where would he put it all? The hotel closet was already cramped. Everything he owned fit into 2 suitcases now. Another purchase would only remind him of how much he had lost. He closed the laptop with a growl and poured another drink. Days passed in a haze of anger. He snapped at Mark when he offered advice. He ignored Daniel's texts. He avoided social gatherings, convinced everyone was gossiping about him. He filled his nights with liquor and late-night channel surfing, waking with headaches and regret. One morning, hungover and late again, he stumbled into the office only to find his manager waiting. "Adrian," she said, folding her arms, "we need to talk." He braced himself. "You're distracted, unfocused. I know you've been through a lot, but the truth is, it's starting to show. Clients notice, colleagues notice." "I'm fine," Adrian insisted. Her expression didn't soften. "You're not. Take time if you need it, but if you keep showing up like this, you'll burn through more than just apartments." The words stung worse than he expected. Adrian left the office, his pride in tatters. That evening, he finally answered one of Daniel's messages. "Meet me," he typed. "Now." They met at a quiet cafe near the river. Adrian was already there when Daniel arrived, pacing outside with a half-finished cigarette in his hand. He hadn't smoked in years, but tonight the anger demanded something to burn. "You look rough," Daniel said softly. "Don't start," Adrian snapped. He dropped into a chair, flicking the cigarette into the gutter. "I can't live like this. I need my life back." Daniel sat across from him, unhurried. "You mean your possessions back?" Adrian slammed his hand on the table. "Don't twist it. You don't understand. Without them, I'm nobody. I walk into a room and I'm invisible. Before, I commanded respect. Now people pity me." Daniel leaned forward. "Respect based on things can be taken as easily as they're given. Is that really the kind of respect you want?" Adrian's fists tightened. "Don't lecture me. You didn't lose everything overnight. You don't know what it's like." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to lose an apartment. But I do know what it's like to lose someone you love. And I know the anger that comes when you think the universe owes you more than it gave. I also know anger is poison. It burns you long after the fire is out." Adrian sat back, chest heaving. The words cut, but not in the way he expected. Daniel continued, his voice even. "Epictetus said, 'When you are distressed by an external thing, it is not the thing itself that troubles you, but your judgment about it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment.'" Adrian shook his head. "So what? It's my fault? My judgment? I didn't set the fire?" "No," Daniel said gently, "but you're feeding the flames every day after. You lost your possessions once, but each night you lose yourself again by anger, by drink, by clinging. That's a choice, and it's killing you more than the fire did." Adrian stared at him, stunned into silence. For a moment, all he could hear was the faint hum of the cafe's refrigeration and the murmur of other patrons. Finally, he whispered, "If I don't hold on to this anger, what's left?" Daniel's eyes softened. Freedom. The hotel manager's tone was polite, but firm. "Mr. Cole, your corporate account hasn't processed payment for the last week. We'll need to resolve this, or unfortunately, you'll have to vacate the suite by tomorrow." Adrian stood at the reception desk, stunned. "That's impossible. Run it again." "We did, several times," the manager replied gently. "Perhaps your bank froze the card." Adrian's face flushed. He had plenty of money, but the fire had scrambled everything. Bank paperwork, account freezes, insurance delays. His assistant usually handled logistics like this, but lately he hadn't been leaning on her. He didn't want to appear weak. Now the consequences were staring him in the face. By evening, he was out. His life fit into 2 suitcases and a briefcase, stacked awkwardly on the curb as taxis whooshed past. For the first time since the fire, he had nowhere to go. Mark's couch was still an option, but Adrian couldn't bring himself to call. He had already leaned too hard on that friendship. Pride gnawed at him. Instead, he found a short-term rental, bare, cheap, a single room with cracked walls and a thin mattress on the floor. When he dragged his bags inside, he nearly gagged at the musty smell. The carpet was threadbare, the blinds crooked, the bathroom sink dripping with a hollow echo. "This isn't me," Adrian whispered. But it was, at least for now. That night, he spread his jacket over the mattress like a makeshift blanket. He lay there, stiff and restless, the springs creaking beneath him. Every sound from the street outside seemed amplified. The honk of cars, the shouting of late-night pedestrians, the rumble of a garbage truck. He couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling and felt humiliation pressing on him like a weight. From a penthouse apartment to a dingy single room. From a walk-in closet of Italian suits to one duffel bag and a hanger. From leather couches and Moroccan rugs to this. He turned over, angry tears pricking at his eyes. The next morning, he met Daniel for coffee. "You look tired," Daniel said gently. "I slept on a floor last night," Adrian muttered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And? Did you survive?" Adrian glared at him. "Barely. It was miserable." Daniel sipped his coffee, unbothered. "The Stoics practiced this on purpose, you know? Sleeping on hard ground, wearing rough clothes, eating plain food. They called it voluntary discomfort." Adrian scoffed. "Why the hell would anyone choose that?" "To remind themselves that wealth is a luxury, not a necessity. Epictetus put it simply. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." Adrian rubbed his face. "That's easy for a philosopher to say, Daniel. I had everything, Daniel. And now I've got nothing but a mattress that feels like a torture device." "Exactly," Daniel said, leaning forward. "And yet, here you are, breathing, drinking coffee, talking to me. Life didn't end when the cushions were stripped away. You're learning, whether you wanted to or not, that you can survive without the extras." Adrian fell silent. He hated to admit it, but Daniel was right. As miserable as the night had been, he had woken up alive, still functioning, still capable of facing the day. Daniel added, "Seneca wrote, 'Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself all the while, "Is this the condition that I feared?'" Adrian frowned. The words rolled through him like water over stone. He imagined Seneca, wealthy and powerful, choosing to live like the poor just to test himself. "Is this the condition that I feared?" Adrian repeated softly. Daniel nodded. "Ask yourself that each night you spend on that floor. You'll find the fear shrinks when faced head-on." That evening, back in his room, Adrian looked at the lumpy mattress differently. It still smelled musty, still sagged, but now it carried a strange challenge. He stretched out on it, feeling the springs jab his back. He whispered into the dark, "Is this the condition that I feared?" The room was silent, but deep down, something shifted. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't glamorous, but it didn't destroy him. And for the first time, Adrian wondered if he could learn to live with less, not just endure it, but perhaps even embrace it. The first week in the dingy room drained Adrian faster than he expected. The mattress was one insult, the noise from the street another. But what broke him most wasn't the sleeplessness or the cracked walls. It was the food. Back at his old life, meals had been theater. Champagne brunches, steak dinners, sushi flown in from Tokyo, wine lists thicker than novels. He used to say, half joking, "I don't eat to live, I live to eat." And people would laugh, because in his circles, indulgence was status. Now, status tasted like canned soup. His first night he ordered takeout, greasy noodles in a plastic container. He ate them on the floor, hunched over, chopsticks snapping in his hand. It felt pathetic. By the third night, he couldn't afford another takeout bill. He had no kitchen to speak of, just a hot plate and a mini fridge. So he walked to the corner store and bought bread, peanut butter, and instant coffee. That became his diet. Toast for breakfast, bread with peanut butter for dinner, coffee strong enough to mask the hunger between. By day 4, his stomach growled constantly. He told himself he was busy, too distracted to care. But at night, when the room fell silent, the emptiness gnawed at him. Saturday, he met Daniel again. They sat on the same park bench beneath the oak tree. Adrian looked thinner already, his suit jacket hanging loose on his shoulders. "You're eating less," Daniel observed. Adrian gave a bitter laugh. "If you call bread and peanut butter eating." Daniel smiled. "The Stoics would call it training." "For what? Starvation?" "For freedom," Daniel said calmly. Epictetus reminded his students that a king can feast, but so can a beggar. Both fill their stomachs. The difference is expectation. The beggar expects little and is content. The king expects everything and is never satisfied. Which one is freer? Adrian scowled. "That's easy to say when you're not the one hungry." Daniel's voice softened. "True, but hunger is a teacher. It shows you how little you actually need." Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." Adrian turned the words over in his head. He thought of the banquets he'd attended, the endless courses, the tastings, the overflowing plates. Even then, he'd always wanted more. Another glass, another bite, another excuse to spend. And yet, here he was, surviving on the simplest fare. Daniel pulled an apple from his bag and handed it to him. He hesitated, then bit into it. The crisp sweetness filled his mouth, flooding his senses with more satisfaction than he expected. "See," Daniel said, watching him, "hunger makes an apple taste better than any imported delicacy." He swallowed, his throat tightening. "It's humiliating," he admitted. "I feel reduced." Daniel shook his head. "Not reduced, refined. You're learning you don't need chandeliers above your head or truffle oil on your plate to be alive. You only need enough. Anything more is decoration." Adrian stared at the half-eaten apple in his hand. He didn't want to admit it, but Daniel was right. The fruit tasted like a gift, not because it was rare, but because his hunger had sharpened his gratitude. That night, back in his room, Adrian ate his bread and peanut butter slowly. He chewed deliberately, noticing the texture, the salt, the faint sweetness. He whispered to himself, "Is this enough?" The surprising answer was yes. For the first time in his adult life, he felt the faint stirrings of humility. And it didn't taste bitter.
Adrian was starting to look forward to his walks with Daniel. The park became their meeting ground, neutral territory where Adrian could confess what he'd never admit at the office. It was a strange comfort, sitting on a splintered bench in worn clothes, talking philosophy like some college kid instead of a man who once signed million-dollar contracts. On this morning, Daniel brought nothing but a small notebook. He flipped it open and scribbled something on the page, then turned it toward Adrian. 2 columns. Left side, within my control. Right side, not within my control. "What's this?" Adrian asked. "Epictetus's most practical lesson," Daniel said. "Everything in life can be divided into these 2 categories. Peace comes from recognizing the line and refusing to chase what doesn't belong to you." Adrian leaned forward, reading the page. "Give me an example." Daniel nodded. "Within your control, your thoughts, your choices, your actions. Not within your control, your possessions, your reputation, what other people think, whether your apartment burns down." Adrian winced at the last one. Daniel continued, "You suffer most when you confuse the 2. You try to control what isn't yours, and you neglect what is. Epictetus said, 'Some things are in our control and others not.' If you think things outside your control are within your control, you will suffer. If you confine yourself to what is truly yours, no one can harm you." Adrian frowned. "So you're saying none of this was my fault? The fire, losing my place, the bank mess. But I still feel like I should have prevented it. Isn't that on me?" Daniel shook his head. "You did what anyone would, but you can't stop a spark once it's lit, or halt bureaucracy once it grinds into motion. You didn't choose the fire, but you do choose how to live now. That choice is yours, and no flame can touch it." Adrian sat back, staring at the notebook. The columns looked so simple, yet the weight of them pressed into his chest. Within my control. Not within my control. How much of his life had been spent clawing at the right-hand column? The promotion, the penthouse, the tailored suits, the endless chase to be admired, envied, validated. He thought he was building control, but in reality, he had chained himself to the whims of luck, money, and opinion. No wonder it all collapsed like ash. That evening, in his room, Adrian tried the exercise himself. He opened a cheap spiral notebook he'd bought at the corner store and drew the same 2 columns. Within my control, my effort at work, my words, my response to loss. Not within my control. Insurance, what people say about me, the fire, the past. He stared at the page for a long time. The words seemed to glow in the dim lamplight, as if mocking him and liberating him at once. He whispered into the silence, "I've been chasing ghosts." For the first time, he felt a flicker of relief. He didn't have to fix everything. He didn't have to restore the old life piece by piece. He only had to master the part that was truly his, himself. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was clarity. And clarity was a beginning. The next day, Adrian found himself eating his bread and peanut butter without resentment. Hunger still gnawed, the mattress still sagged, but now he saw them differently. They were in his control, at least in how he chose to meet them. He thought of Daniel's words and Epictetus's too, echoing like a refrain. No one can harm you if you stay with what is yours. For the first time since the fire, Adrian didn't feel completely powerless.
Adrian hadn't planned on going to the bar that Friday night, but an old colleague called, Martin, one of his closest companions in the corporate circuit. Martin's voice was upbeat, almost patronizing. "Come on, Cole. We haven't seen you in weeks. We're meeting at Vellum, the rooftop spot. First round's on me." Adrian hesitated. Vellum was where deals got signed, where influencers posted selfies with $200 cocktails, where the city skyline glittered like jewelry. He knew he shouldn't go. He was different now. He was supposed to be different. But a voice inside whispered, "Maybe you need to prove you're not completely broken. Maybe you can still belong." So he went. The elevator opened to the rooftop lounge, and it was like stepping back into his old skin. Music thumped, glasses clinked, everyone dressed in sleek fabrics, dripping confidence. Martin greeted him with a bear hug and a whiskey already in hand. "Look at you, man. We thought you'd fallen off the planet." Adrian forced a laugh. "Just laying low." The table was covered in tapas plates, truffle fries, lobster sliders, caviar tins. Bottles of champagne sat in silver buckets. Adrian's stomach growled instantly, betraying the days of peanut butter and stale bread. He told himself he wouldn't indulge. Just one drink, polite conversation, then leave. But then came the toasts, the laughter, the glint of old familiarity. Someone ordered another round and another. Adrian found himself eating greedily, like a man starved, which, in truth, he was. The salt, the fat, the luxury. He devoured it all, ashamed but unable to stop. When Martin leaned close and said, "I've got a new project starting. You'd fit right in if you've got the time," Adrian's chest swelled. For a moment he was back. The old Adrian, the one people admired, the one who hadn't lost everything. But the illusion cracked when the bill arrived. Martin covered most of it, but the server slid Adrian's portion across the table. $187. One night, one meal, nearly a week's worth of food in his new life. His hands shook as he signed the receipt. The numbers glared up at him, mocking him, reminding him of what he no longer had. On the walk home, the city lights felt harsh, like neon knives stabbing his eyes. His stomach churned, not just from the food, but from shame. He had betrayed the lessons he'd been learning. For what? A few hours of pretending he still belonged to that world? When he finally collapsed onto his lumpy mattress, the contrast hit him like a punch. Just hours ago, velvet seats, champagne, lobster. Now, sagging springs and peeling paint. He buried his face in his hands. I'm pathetic. The next day, he confessed everything to Daniel. I screwed up, Adrian muttered, staring at the ground. I went out, I ate like a pig, I spent money I don't have. I thought I was past this, but I'm not. Daniel listened quietly, then said, You stumbled. That doesn't erase the path. Adrian looked up, confused. Seneca warned about this. He said, No man is so utterly dull as not to feel the truth, though he may not always have the strength to abide by it. You felt the truth when you saw that bill, didn't you? When you lay back on your mattress. I nodded slowly. That's the lesson. Temptation isn't failure, it's a mirror. It shows you where the grip of your old self is strongest. You saw it last night, and you hated it. That hatred means you're changing. Adrian exhaled, the tension loosening slightly. Minimalism isn't about never slipping. It's about knowing the difference between what nourishes you and what chains you. Last night chained you. Remember that feeling. Next time, you'll choose differently. That night, Adrian wrote in his notebook under Within My Control. Saying no to invitations that pull me backward. How much I eat. How I respond to temptation. And under Not Within My Control. Whether people forget me if I don't show up. Whether Martin respects me. He closed the notebook, feeling both weak and oddly stronger. He had stumbled, yes, but maybe that stumble was part of walking.
Saturday morning sunlight spilled across the city, painting even the cracked windows of Adrian's rented room with a kind of quiet dignity. He had $20 left in his wallet. The temptation was immediate. Down the block was the cafe he used to frequent, the kind with brass light fixtures and croissants stacked like art. He could almost smell the coffee drifting through the street, strong and dark, like the mornings of his old life. His stomach tightened. He had been living off bread and peanut butter all week again. The thought of hot coffee and a real breakfast was intoxicating. He reached for his wallet, and then he stopped. A voice rose in his mind, not his own, Daniel's. Temptation isn't failure, it's a mirror. He pulled out his notebook instead of his wallet. The page stared back at him. Within my control. How much I eat, saying no to invitations that pull me backward, my response to temptation. Adrian stood frozen on the sidewalk, the smell of coffee clawing at him. He whispered under his breath, "What do I want more, a croissant or control?" The word hung there. Control. Slowly, deliberately, he turned away from the cafe and walked toward the small grocery store instead. He bought a bag of oats, a carton of milk, and a few apples. Less than $8, enough for the week. Back in his room, he cooked the oats on the hot plate. The smell wasn't indulgent, not like butter and espresso, but it was warm. He sliced one of the apples, dropped the pieces into the pot, and stirred. When he sat down on the edge of the mattress to eat, something shifted. The meal wasn't glamorous, but it was his choice. Not a default, not a resignation, but an active decision to spend less, to live with less, to own the choice rather than let it own him. He took a bite. The oats were soft, the apple sweet, the simplicity almost startling. And for the first time in months, he felt proud. Not proud in the old way, the smugness of having more than others, but proud in a quieter, sturdier way. Proud that he had turned from temptation, that he had proven to himself he wasn't completely enslaved to old cravings. It was a small victory, a breakfast victory, but it was his. Later that day, he met Daniel in the park again. "You look lighter," Daniel said, tilting his head. Adrian told him about the cafe, the oats, the apple. He half expected Daniel to laugh at the triviality of it, but Daniel smiled. "That," Daniel said, "is freedom." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "From skipping a croissant? From proving you don't need one?" Daniel's voice carried warmth, almost pride. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." This morning, you were master. That's no small thing. Adrian let the words sink in. For so long, freedom had meant money, choice, the ability to buy whatever he wanted. Now, it meant the opposite, not needing. It was disorienting, but also clarifying. That night, Adrian wrote in his notebook, "Today, I won a small battle. I chose less and found more. I chose control over craving, and it felt like enough." He closed the book, lay back on the lumpy mattress, and for the first time since the fire, sleep came easily. Not because he was full, not because he was comfortable, but because his mind was at rest. It was a quiet victory, and it was his.
The autumn air was sharp that Sunday. Leaves crunched under Adrian's shoes as he walked toward the park, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He felt calmer than he had in months. The quiet victory of oats and apples still lingered with him, but he was cautious, as if one misstep might shatter the fragile progress. Daniel was already on their bench when Adrian arrived. Instead of his usual notebook, he held a slim paperback. The cover was plain, the pages yellowed from time. "What's that?" Adrian asked, sitting down beside him. Daniel tapped the book. "Seneca. I thought you were ready." Adrian smirked. "Ready for what? More reminders that I've ruined my life?" Daniel's expression softened. "Not ruined, just unmasked. Listen to this." He flipped to a page, cleared his throat, and read slowly. "We are not given a short life, but we make it short, and we are not ill-supplied, but wasteful of it. Life is long if you know how to use it." Adrian blinked. "That's different from what I expected." Daniel nodded. Seneca believed time is our most precious possession. We guard our money, we guard our homes, but we spend our days as if they're worthless. The truth is, everything can burn, everything can be stolen, except how you use this moment. Adrian stared at the ground. He thought of the years he'd spent climbing, collecting, posturing, all those hours invested in appearances, all that time gone. He whispered, almost to himself, "So I didn't just lose things in the fire. I lost time." Daniel heard him. "Yes, and you'll lose more unless you stop wasting it on what you can't control." Seneca again, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man. Accept loss, accept death, and you free yourself to live." The words struck deeper than Adrian expected. For weeks he had mourned his apartment, his suits, his curated life. But now he saw the greater theft, not the fire, but how much of his life had already been burned away by chasing the trivial. For the first time, the idea of impermanence didn't terrify him. It humbled him. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk with the notebook open, writing furiously. "Everything is borrowed. My apartment was borrowed, my career status borrowed, even my body, my breath, my time borrowed. One day, all must be returned. Why cling to what was never mine to keep?" The thought both chilled and freed him. He realized the fire had only sped up the inevitable. Everything he thought permanent was fragile all along. 2 days later, the lesson was tested. Adrian received a call from his sister. Their mother had been hospitalized, briefly. Minor heart trouble, but enough to rattle the family. Adrian's chest tightened. Panic surged, fear that loss might strike again. He almost ran straight to the hospital, but Daniel's words came back. "Accept loss, and you free yourself to live." When he arrived, his mother was sitting up in bed, smiling tiredly, already improving. Adrian sat at her side, holding her hand. For once, he didn't try to plan, didn't try to control the outcome. He just stayed present, grateful for that hour, for that borrowed time. It wasn't permanent. Nothing was, and that was what made it precious. That evening, he wrote again. "I fear less tonight. If everything is borrowed, then gratitude is the only proper response. I don't own this life. I get to use it, for a while. And maybe that's enough." Adrian closed the notebook, set it beside the bed, and lay back on the mattress. The room was still bare, the mattress still lumpy, but his heart, strangely, felt full. Seneca's voice echoed in him, through Daniel. "Life is long if you know how to use it." For the first time, Adrian didn't dread tomorrow. He was beginning to learn how.
The idea came from Daniel. They were walking along the river one gray afternoon, steam rising from the city's grates, the water below sluggish and cold. Daniel said, Seneca had a habit. For a few days each month, he would eat the cheapest food, wear rough clothes, and ask himself, "Is this the condition I so feared?" He called it practicing poverty. Adrian frowned. "Practicing poverty? I thought poverty was something you either had or didn't." Daniel shook his head. "That's what most people think. But Seneca understood something. Poverty terrifies because it's unknown. We imagine it as endless suffering. But if you live it, by choice, you learn its limits. And once you know its limits, fear loses its grip." Adrian thought of his mattress, his thin meals, his bare walls. He had stumbled into poverty by accident, through fire and ruin. Could he possibly choose it now, even deepen it as practice? The idea unsettled him, but also intrigued him. The next week, Adrian began his first experiment. He put aside even the little comfort he'd gained. No hot plate, no grocery store apples. For 3 days, he would eat only bread and water. He pulled an old hoodie from the back of his closet, one frayed at the sleeves, and wore it every day. At first, it felt like punishment. His stomach growled louder than ever. The bread grew dry and tasteless by the second day. On the third night, lying on the mattress, he muttered, "This is ridiculous. I've already lost everything. Why would I choose to suffer more?" But then he remembered Seneca's words read aloud by Daniel. "Set aside a certain number of days, during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, so that it may be said, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" Adrian sat up, staring at the cracked ceiling. He whispered, "Is this it? This is the worst? Bread, water, hunger?" And slowly, the answer rose in him. Yes, this was it, and it was survivable. On the fourth day, when he finally returned to oats and apples, he felt something strange. Joy. Not the desperate, guilty joy of indulgence, but gratitude. The food tasted richer, sweeter, because he had seen the bottom. He had lived poverty on purpose, and it hadn't killed him. It had freed him. That weekend, Adrian told Daniel what he had done. Daniel's eyes lit up. And I didn't die, Adrian said with a crooked smile. I was hungry, yeah, but it wasn't the monster I thought it was. It was just bread and water. Daniel nodded. That's the point. Once you've tested poverty, it stops being a nightmare in your head. You learn it's tolerable. And then, when life strips things away again, you can say, I've been here before. It's not so bad. Adrian exhaled. So you're telling me the secret is not avoiding hardship, but rehearsing it? Daniel grinned. Exactly. Comfort makes us soft. Practicing poverty makes us strong. That night, Adrian wrote in his notebook, I used to think poverty was the end of life. Now I see it's just another kind of life. Practicing it shows me I can endure. It shows me how little I actually need. And once you know you can survive with little, nothing owns you anymore. For the first time since the fire, Adrian didn't just feel lighter, he felt unshakable. Not because he had gained something, but because he had proven to himself he could lose almost everything and still remain.
The test came when he least expected it. Adrian was walking downtown one evening after work, his backpack slung over his shoulder. The streetlights were just flickering on, washing the storefronts in a golden glow. He hadn't walked this way in months, not since the fire. And then he saw it. The bar, his bar. The place where he used to close deals, laugh too loudly, sip whiskey that cost more than a week's groceries. Through the glass windows, he could see men in tailored suits, women with polished nails, laughter spilling out with the clink of glasses. For a moment,
It was like nothing had changed. He could almost imagine himself pushing through the doors, loosening his tie, basking in the recognition, the nods of respect. His throat burned with longing, not for the whiskey itself, but for the belonging. His steps slowed. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the $20 bill folded there. Daniel's voice stirred in his head. Poverty isn't the end of life. It's just another kind of life. Once you know you can live with little, nothing owns you anymore. But tonight, the words felt fragile against the weight of habit. Adrian stood frozen on the sidewalk. People brushed past him, heading inside, laughing, ordering drinks. One man clapped another on the back, and Adrian felt a pang like hunger in his chest. He whispered, "What's the harm? Just one drink, just one night." But then another voice came, harsher, his own. "And tomorrow? And the day after? You think you can step into the fire and not get burned?" He pulled himself away, almost violently, and ducked into an alley. His heart pounded, his palms sweaty. He leaned against the wall, shaking. It wasn't whiskey he craved, it was his old identity, the polished man, the one who looked untouchable, the one who never had to explain himself. That man had burned in the fire, but tonight, Adrian realized he wasn't gone completely. He was hiding in the shadows, waiting for an opening. That night, he told Daniel what had happened. Daniel listened quietly, then asked, "And what did you do?" Adrian said, "I walked away." His voice cracked, partly from shame, partly from relief. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's strength. Not because the temptation went away, but because you faced it and chose differently." Adrian shook his head. "It didn't feel like strength. It felt like war, and I barely won." Daniel leaned forward. "That's exactly what it is. Seneca said, 'No man is crushed by misfortune unless he has first been deceived by prosperity.' You were deceived once into thinking your worth was in those bars, those suits. Now you're fighting not to be deceived again." Adrian sat back, absorbing the words. War. Yes, that's what it felt like. But maybe war was necessary. That night, he wrote, "Old habits don't die in the fire. They wait outside the ashes. Today, I saw the ghost of my old self, and for a moment, I wanted him back. But I walked away. That wasn't weakness. That was strength." He underlined the last sentence twice. Then he put down the pen, turned off the light, and though sleep was restless, he knew something had shifted. The pull of old habits was strong, but stronger still was his will to resist.
It began with exhaustion. Adrian had been grinding through long work days at the temp office, then returning home to his stripped-down apartment, still restless, still searching for something to fill the empty hours. But nothing worked. Books, walks, even his conversations with Daniel. His mind buzzed constantly, like a swarm of bees he couldn't quiet. One evening he dropped onto the mattress frustrated. "I can't keep my head still," he muttered. Daniel, who had stopped by with 2 steaming cups of tea, tilted his head. "Have you tried listening to it?" Adrian frowned. "To what?" "To the noise," Daniel said simply. "Sit with it. Don't run. Don't fight. Just sit in silence and watch." Adrian groaned. "Sounds like torture." Daniel smiled. "It will feel like it at first. But silence isn't torture. It's medicine." The next morning, Adrian tried. He woke early, before the city roared to life. The room was gray, the air still. He sat cross-legged on the floor, closed his eyes,
and waited. At first, all he heard was the hum of the radiator and the screech of brakes outside. But then came the avalanche, the racing thoughts, regrets, what-ifs, self-criticism. His mind replayed every failure, every temptation, every image of the life he once had. He almost got up right then. But Daniel's words echoed, "Sit with it." So he stayed. He let the thoughts rise and fall, like waves. 10 minutes passed, 15. Eventually the tide slowed. His breath grew steady. A small, strange calm began to spread through his chest. When he finally opened his eyes, the room hadn't changed, but something in him had. He repeated the practice the next day, and the next. At first, for 10 minutes, then 20. Slowly, silence became less an enemy, more of a refuge. One morning, sitting in stillness, a thought came that startled him. I used to fear being alone, but maybe aloneness was what I needed most. He realized how much of his old life had been noise, bars, parties, endless scrolling, constant distraction. Noise to drown out the unease he carried. Now, stripped bare, the noise was gone, and in its absence, he was learning to hear something new, himself. Later that week, he told Daniel about the experience. Daniel nodded knowingly. That's the Stoic way. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Stillness is how we practice mastery. Without it, we're slaves to impulse. With it, we begin to choose. Adrian thought about the bar, the temptation, how his legs had almost carried him inside without permission. He shivered. So the silence trains me not to be dragged by myself. Exactly. The noise of the world isn't half as dangerous as the noise of the mind. Learn stillness, and you learn freedom. That night, Adrian wrote in his notebook, "I always chased noise. Noise was easier than silence. But now I see silence is not emptiness. It is strength. In silence, I meet myself. And for once, I don't run."
The first test came at work. Adrian had been at the temp office for a few months, long enough for coworkers to start asking questions. Why didn't he go out for lunch with the team? Why didn't he update his wardrobe? Why was he always carrying the same scuffed backpack? At first, he brushed off the comments with half smiles. But one Friday afternoon, as everyone was packing up, his colleague Mark leaned across the cubicle wall and said, loud enough for others to hear, "Hey Adrian, don't take this the wrong way, but are you doing okay? You always look like you're on the brink of moving out of a dorm." The room erupted in laughter. Adrian forced a chuckle, but his face burned. That old voice rose inside. "You see, they think you're nothing. They think you failed. You used to be the man in the suit. Now look at you, forgotten, pitied, mocked." He clenched his jaw and left without a word. That night, he stormed into Daniel's apartment, pacing the floor. "They laughed at me," Adrian spat, "at my clothes, at my bag, like I'm some kind of charity case. And you know what? Maybe I am. Maybe I am a failure." Daniel watched him calmly, sipping tea. "Why does their laughter wound you?" "Because they're right," Adrian snapped. "I used to walk into a room and get respect. Now I walk in and get pity." Daniel set down the cup. "Respect from who?" Adrian froze. "Respect from people who measure worth in shoes and watches? Is that respect? Or fear of losing their own place in the game?" Adrian sank into a chair, rubbing his temples. "Easy for you to say. You don't work with them every day." Daniel's voice softened. "Epictetus said, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. They mocked you, yes, but that's not failure. That's proof you're on a different path.
one they can't understand yet. The words stung, but also soothed. That weekend, Adrian faced another test. He was invited to a birthday dinner by an old friend, James, one of his bar crowd. Adrian debated skipping, but guilt won out. At the restaurant, the table was covered in dishes, steaks, cocktails, desserts. Adrian ordered water and the cheapest side salad, earning raised eyebrows. "Come on, man! Since when do you count pennies? Don't tell me you've gone cheap on us." The others joined in. Adrian smiled thinly, pushing the salad around his plate. Inside, he was boiling. The temptation to prove them wrong, to order the most expensive dish just to show he could, gnawed at him. But then he remembered Seneca's line Daniel had once quoted. "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." He sat back, exhaled slowly, and let the moment pass. When the bill came, he paid his modest share without shame. Walking home later, the cool night air washing over him, Adrian realized something startling. The shame was gone. He had been tested, mocked, pressured, tempted, and he had stayed the course. Minimalism wasn't just theory anymore. It was becoming part of him. That night, his journal entry was short, but firm. "I used to think wealth gave me strength. Today, I saw the truth. Strength is eating a salad while others mock you and feeling no need to prove them wrong. Strength is walking away lighter, freer, untouched." For the first time, Adrian wasn't just surviving minimalism. He was defending it, and he was winning.
It happened on a Tuesday, during the office lunch break. Adrian was sitting outside on a bench, unwrapping a plain sandwich he'd packed from home. While others crowded into restaurants or ordered takeout, Adrian preferred the quiet. The sun was warm, the breeze light. For once, he felt at ease. A coworker, Sarah, approached and hesitated. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course," Adrian said, sliding over. She settled down, glancing at his sandwich, then at her plastic container of sushi. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why do you, I don't know, live like this?" She gestured vaguely at his worn shoes, his simple lunch, his battered backpack. "You don't seem broke exactly, but you also don't care about any of it?" Adrian smiled faintly. "I guess you could say I used to care too much. Now I'm learning not to." Sarah tilted her head. "Doesn't it bother you? People talking, joking about it?" "It used to," Adrian admitted, "but I realize their words don't change who I am. If I need less, I'm freer. What they say can't take that away." She fell silent, staring at her sushi. Then she said quietly, "I wish I could think like that. I'm drowning in credit card debt, but I keep buying things just to keep up. It feels like a trap." Adrian studied her face. He saw the same fear he'd once carried. He thought of Daniel, how patient he'd been, never forcing, only guiding. "You're not trapped," Adrian said gently. "You just think you are. The chains are made of your own habits. Change the habit, and the chain breaks." That evening, Sarah's words stayed with him. He hadn't set out to advise her. He'd just spoken honestly. And yet he realized he'd given her something Daniel had once given him, a glimpse of another way. It startled him, this shift. For so long he'd been the one learning, fumbling, leaning on others. But now he was the one someone else looked to. Over the next weeks, it happened again and again. A neighbor in his building asked why Adrian seemed so calm lately. A cousin at a family gathering noticed how little he fussed over appearances. Even Mark, the colleague who had mocked his backpack, one day asked, half joking, "So what's your secret? You some kind of monk now?" He laughed it off, but inside he felt something steady growing. He wasn't lecturing. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was simply living, and people noticed. That evening, walking with Daniel, Adrian shared what had been happening. Daniel listened, then nodded approvingly. That's the way of it. The Stoics didn't just write, they lived. Their example taught more than their words ever could. Adrian frowned, but I'm no philosopher. I'm still struggling every day. Daniel chuckled. Exactly. That's why people notice. You're real. You're not pretending to be perfect. You're practicing. That practice shines brighter than any speech. He thought about it. He remembered Sarah's weary eyes, the laugh at work, the neighbor's question. For the first time in his life, he realized influence wasn't about power, wealth, or charm. It was about authenticity. That night, his journal entry was simple. I never set out to teach, but maybe teaching isn't about lessons. It's about living openly. If my struggle can ease someone else's, then every battle I've fought has meaning. He closed the notebook with a quiet sense of purpose. The student within him was still learning, but now the teacher within him had begun to awaken.
It started with a smell. Adrian was walking home one evening when the wind carried the faint scent of cologne and cigarette smoke drifting out of the crowded bar. Laughter spilled onto the street, sharp and alive. For a moment, his feet slowed. He glanced through the open door. Inside, he saw a younger version of himself, a man in a tailored suit, drink in hand, surrounded by friends, confident and loud. His chest tightened. That used to be me. He shook it off and kept walking, but the image stayed, gnawing. The next few days were restless. His silence practice, once steady, was agitated. His mind replayed scenes of his old life, fine dinners, expensive clothes, late-night parties. He tried to shrug them off, but the memories came with an ache, a whisper of loss. By Friday, the whisper became a shout. After work, instead of heading home, he found himself standing outside the very bar he'd passed earlier in the week. His legs had carried him there without permission. "Just one drink," he muttered. "No harm in that." And with that, he stepped inside. The lights were dim, the air thick with chatter and music. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a time machine. The bartender nodded, and Adrian ordered his old favorite without hesitation. The first sip burned down his throat like fire and memory all at once. He felt alive again, charmed, confident, part of the crowd. One drink became two. Two became three. Soon he was laughing with strangers, telling stories louder than anyone, the way he used to. For a few hours, he forgot everything. The fire, the loss, the silence, the lessons. But when the night ended and he stumbled back into the cold air, the illusion shattered. His head spun, his stomach churned. He fumbled for his keys and barely made it inside his apartment before collapsing onto the mattress. The next morning was brutal. His mouth was dry, his head pounding. He sat hunched in the gray light, shame pressing down harder than the hangover. "You were doing so well. You resisted temptation. You inspired people. And now look at you, weak, pathetic, right back where you started." The voice was merciless. Adrian buried his face in his hands. That afternoon, Daniel came by unannounced. One look at Adrian's face, the stale smell of alcohol in the air, and he understood. "You slipped," Daniel said softly. I couldn't meet his eyes. I ruined everything. Daniel sat across from him. "Did you?" "I went back," Adrian said bitterly. "After all I've learned, all the progress I made, I threw it away in one night." Daniel laughed harshly. "Feels the same." Daniel leaned forward. Epictetus warned us, no man is free who is not master of himself. You lost control, yes, but mastery isn't about never falling. It's about how you rise after you fall. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. Seneca wrote, "To err is human, but to persist in the error is foolish." Last night was human. What you choose today will decide if it becomes foolish. Adrian sat in silence, the words cutting deep. Slowly, a fragile thought emerged. Maybe he hadn't undone everything. Maybe this was part of the path. That night, he opened his journal with trembling hands. I relapsed. I drowned myself in noise, trying to feel alive again. But the life I wanted to resurrect is gone. It burned with the fire. I can't go back. Last night reminded me why I started. Because I was a slave to pleasure, to appearance, to noise. Today, I choose not to persist in the error. Today, I rise. He closed the notebook. His head still ached, his body still heavy, but his spirit, faintly, had begun to stand.
The office was unusually quiet that Monday morning. Adrian sat at his desk, tapping his pen against a blank page in his notebook. His body was back in rhythm, but his mind carried the weight of Saturday's relapse. He could hide it. No one from work had seen him in the bar. No one would know. But Sarah's words came back to him. "I wish I could think like that. I'm drowning in debt. It feels like a trap." If he stayed silent, he'd be a fraud. At lunch, he found her sitting outside, the same spot where she'd first asked about his choices. She smiled when she saw him. "Hey, how was your weekend?" Adrian sat down slowly. His stomach tightened. "Rough," he admitted. Her brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" He took a breath. "I slipped. Went back to an old habit. Got drunk. Stayed out late. For a few hours, I was the same man I used to be." Sarah looked surprised, then oddly relieved. Adrian frowned. "Why are you smiling?" "Because you're human," she said simply. "I thought you were some kind of machine, like you'd figured it all out and never struggled anymore." Adrian shook his head. "I struggle every day. Saturday I lost, and I feel like I let you down. I gave you advice, then I went and broke it myself." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't let me down. If anything, this makes me trust you more. At least I know you're not pretending. You're actually fighting, just like the rest of us." Her words hit him harder than any lecture. He'd expected disappointment. Instead, he found grace. That evening, he told Daniel about the conversation. "I feel like I let her down." He said, "She forgave me." "Because you were honest." Seneca said, "To confess a fault freely is the nearest approach to innocence." You showed her your wound, and instead of weakness, she saw courage. Adrian stared at the floor. "I thought strength was never failing." "No," Daniel said gently. "Strength is standing after you failed and letting others see that you can still stand." Later, Adrian sat by the window with his journal. Apology felt like tearing off armor, exposing the softest part of myself. But instead of attack, I found kindness. Maybe this is another secret. When we drop the mask, others drop theirs too. For the first time, Adrian realized that Stoicism wasn't just about enduring storms or stripping away possessions. It was also about honesty. Radical, uncomfortable honesty. The hardest apology had become his most liberating act.
Adrian had avoided looking too closely at his apartment for months.
After the fire, he'd furnished it with donated pieces and second-hand finds. Mismatched chairs, boxes he never unpacked, a few relics of his old life. He had told himself it didn't matter. But lately, every time he walked in the door, the clutter pressed down on him. On Saturday morning, sunlight cut through the blinds and fell across a stack of half-forgotten boxes in the corner. He stared at them. Inside were things he hadn't touched in over a year. Watches, cufflinks, a leather briefcase, scorched at the edges but kept for nostalgia. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he whispered aloud, "Why am I still carrying this?" The purge began slowly. He opened the first box and pulled out the briefcase. Once, it had been a symbol of success. Now it was just a scarred container, heavy with memory. He set it aside for donation. Next came the watches. He picked up one, polished steel glinting in the morning light. He remembered the night he bought it after a big deal, how proud he'd felt. But now the pride felt hollow, a ghost of a man he no longer was. He dropped it into the donation pile. Box after box, item after item, the weight seemed to lift. The piles for donation grew taller. The apartment grew emptier. And with every item gone, Adrian felt himself breathe a little easier. By afternoon, the apartment looked almost bare. The mismatched chairs were gone. The boxes were gone. Even the bookshelf, once packed with business manuals and glossy decor books, now held only a handful of volumes. Seneca's letters, Epictetus's teachings, a journal, and a single novel he loved. When the last bag was carried out, Adrian stood in the center of his living room. The space was quiet. Sunlight touched the walls with an almost sacred stillness. It wasn't emptiness, it was clarity. That evening, Sarah dropped by. She stopped short when she walked in. "Wow, did you get robbed?" Adrian chuckled. "No, I got free." She wandered through the apartment, eyes wide. "There's nothing here." "Nothing I don't need," Adrian corrected. She touched the empty shelf, the bare table. "Doesn't it feel lonely?" Adrian thought about it. "No, it feels honest. Everything left here matters. The rest was noise." Sarah looked around again slowly. "I think I get it." Later, when Daniel visited, Adrian told him what he'd done. Daniel nodded approvingly. Seneca once wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." You're learning that wealth isn't in what you keep, but in what you can walk away from. Adrian smiled faintly. "Funny, I thought letting go would feel like loss, but it feels more like gain." Daniel raised his glass of water. "To space, then. Space for what matters." Adrian clinked his glass. For the first time since the fire, his home felt like it matched his soul. Lighter, freer, whole. That night, his journal entry was simple. "Today, I emptied my home, and in doing so, I emptied myself of shadows I didn't know I carried. The silence in these rooms doesn't scare me. It welcomes me. I thought I'd lost a life in the fire, but maybe I only burned away the lies. What's left is the truth."
The following week at work, Adrian noticed something unusual. Sarah was packing her lunch into a smaller container. The usual name-brand soda was gone, replaced by water in a plain bottle. At her desk, the pile of shopping catalogs had vanished. When Adrian raised an eyebrow, she caught his look. "What?" she asked defensively. "Nothing,"
he said, smiling. "Just different." She shrugged. "You made it look easy, so I'm trying." Adrian blinked. He hadn't told her to do anything. He hadn't given advice or lectures. He had simply chosen differently, and now she was too. Over the next few days, he noticed other ripples. A coworker who once teased him about bringing a simple homemade lunch started doing the same. Another stopped bragging about his new gadgets and instead asked Adrian how he managed to stay calm in stressful meetings. It was subtle, almost invisible, but like a stone dropped in water, his choices were creating quiet rings that spread outward. One evening, Sarah approached him again. "You know, you never actually told me what to do, but just watching you, it made me think. Maybe I don't need half the stuff I thought I did. Maybe I don't need to keep chasing." Adrian considered this. "I'm not trying to change anyone." "I know," she said. "That's why it works." Her words struck him. All his life he had tried to impress others by showing off, cars, clothes, dinners. But now, without trying, without even speaking, he was influencing people more deeply than ever before. That weekend, Adrian visited Daniel and shared what was happening. Daniel smiled knowingly. Epictetus said, "Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. You're doing that, and people can't help but notice." Adrian let the thought sink in. "So I don't have to convince anyone?" "Convince?" he chuckled. "No. The man shouting about his way of life is usually the least secure in it. The one who lives it quietly, that's the one others believe." Adrian leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he realized that his transformation wasn't just for him. His choices, his discipline, his silence, it all spoke louder than words ever could. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Influence isn't in arguments or speeches. It's in being. A calm man teaches calm. A free man teaches freedom. Today, without speaking, I taught, and I was taught that living honestly is the loudest voice of all." He set the pen down, the room still and uncluttered. For once, he didn't feel the need to explain himself, to others, to the world. His life was the explanation, and quietly, it was enough.
Adrian had noticed something strange in recent weeks. The less he spoke, the more people listened when he did. In meetings, he no longer rushed to fill every pause with his opinion. He waited. Sometimes he didn't speak at all, and yet when he finally did, the room leaned in. His words carried weight, not because they were louder or fancier, but because they were rare. Silence, he realized, had become his strongest voice. At home, silence was no longer a void. It was a companion. In the mornings, he sat by the bare window with a cup of coffee, watching the city stir awake. He didn't scroll through his phone or blast music. He let the quiet wash over him. At first, the habit had been uncomfortable, his thoughts too noisy, his restlessness too sharp. But over time, the silence became a sharpening stone, honing his mind. He remembered something Daniel had said. The mind, like the body, grows strong with resistance. Silence was that resistance. It forced him to wrestle with his own thoughts until they bent into clarity. One afternoon, during a particularly tense workday, Adrian's boss snapped at the team. Voices rose, people argued, and the air thickened with stress. Adrian stayed quiet. Not passive, just calm, steady. He listened, he observed. When the noise finally burned itself out, he spoke one clear sentence that cut through the chaos. The room stilled, and the argument dissolved. Later, Sarah whispered to him, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Stay calm, stay quiet. Everyone else was losing it, and you weren't." Adrian smiled faintly. Silence is harder than shouting, but it's stronger too. That evening, he brought the thought to Daniel.
Silence feels like strength now, Adrian admitted. Daniel nodded. Musonius Rufus taught that sometimes the best proof of wisdom is restraint. Anyone can speak. Few can stay silent when silence is wiser. Adrian tilted his head. But isn't silence weakness, like avoiding conflict? Daniel shook his head. Not if the silence is chosen. Weakness is silence born of fear. Strength is silence born of mastery. The distinction struck Adrian like lightning. He'd been silent in the beginning because he was broken, stripped of everything. But now, he was silent because he chose to be, because he saw its power. That night, his journal entry was brief, fittingly so. Noise drowns the weak. Silence crowns the strong. Today I learned, restraint is not emptiness, it is force held in reserve. For the first time, Adrian didn't fear being unseen or unheard. He knew his presence was louder than noise, stronger than clamor. And in that silence, he felt unshakable.
The email arrived on a Wednesday morning. Subject line, Client Emergency. Immediate response needed. Adrian opened it, heart sinking. The company's largest client was threatening to walk after a contract error. $1 million account was at risk, and his team was already panicking. By the time Adrian reached the conference room, the noise was deafening. Coworkers shouted over one another, pointing fingers, tossing blame. The air reeked of stress. Adrian stood quietly by the door. He let the storm rage for a few minutes. Then, when the shouting reached its peak, he spoke. Has anyone checked the source of the error? The room fell silent. No one had. Over the next 2 hours, Adrian guided the team, not by barking orders, but by steady presence. He asked calm, pointed questions. He sifted through details patiently. His silence between comments was deliberate, slowing the room's frantic pace. Finally, the problem surfaced. A simple miscommunication in a contract clause. Not catastrophic, fixable. The client, who had demanded a call that afternoon, was ready for war. But when Adrian spoke with them, his tone was level. He admitted the error plainly, offered a solution without defensiveness, and promised clarity going forward. By the end of the call, the client not only agreed to stay, they thanked him for his honesty. That evening, Sarah caught him in the break room. "You didn't lose your cool once," she said, shaking her head. "Everyone else was ready to explode. How did you do that?" Adrian thought for a moment before answering. "By remembering what's mine to control and what isn't. Epictetus said, we suffer not from the events in our lives, but from our judgment about them. I couldn't control the error. I couldn't control the client's anger. But I could control myself." Sarah looked at him, half in awe. "So, the philosophy, it's not just talk." "No," Adrian said softly. "It's only real when it's tested." That evening, Adrian wrote in his journal, "Today, the storm came, but I did not add thunder to it. I was the calm, and calm became the anchor for others. Philosophy is not for quiet mornings, it is for the hours when the world shakes and shouts. Today, I learned I can stand." He closed the journal and set it on the bare table. For the first time, he didn't just believe in Stoicism, he knew it lived in him. Because when it's tested, it held.
The apartment was silent, save for the faint scratch of Adrian's pen. He hadn't planned to write the letter. The idea had come to him suddenly, while clearing out the last of his old belongings. At the bottom of a box, he had found a photograph of himself at a gala, grinning, champagne glass raised, wearing a suit that probably cost more than his current month's rent. He stared at the photograph for a long time, then sat down at the table with his journal. Instead of his usual entry, he began with a new heading, "To the man I used to be." You will not recognize me, and I no longer fully recognize you. You thought you were strong because of your possessions, but I see now how fragile you were, how every watch, every car, every applause was armor you wrapped around emptiness. You thought you were free because you could buy anything, but you were chained to those very things, dragging them like anchors wherever you went. Your closet was full, but your mind was cluttered. Your table was crowded, but your soul was starved. I don't hate you. I understand you. You wanted to matter. You wanted to be seen. And for a time that illusion worked. But I must tell you what you could not see then. The fire was not your ending. It was your gift. It burned away what was false, so truth could remain. Adrian paused, his chest tightening. He hadn't realized how much he needed to say these words, to himself, to the version of him still trapped in that endless chase. He continued, "You will lose much, but in losing, you will gain yourself. You will learn that silence is strength, that emptiness is clarity, that simplicity is not poverty but power. You will discover that peace never lived in the things you owned, but in the self you ignored. One day, you will give away what you once thought defined you, and instead of feeling less, you will feel free. That freedom will be worth more than every dollar you ever spent to impress strangers who barely remembered your name. I do not write this to shame you. I write it to thank you for walking the hard road that led me here. Without your mistakes, I could not have learned. Without your hunger, I could not have found stillness. Goodbye, old friend. Rest now. I will carry us forward, lighter, stronger, true." When Adrian finished, he set the pen down. His hands trembled. The letter wasn't meant for anyone else, but it felt like a bridge had been built inside him, a connection, a reconciliation. The man he was and the man he had become were no longer enemies. They were part of the same journey. Adrian folded the page and slid it into the back of his journal. He didn't need to read it again. Just writing it had been enough. As he sat in the stillness, he realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't only for others. Sometimes it was for yourself. And in that moment, Adrian forgave.
It came without warning. The call arrived late one night. His father had collapsed. A stroke. He was in the hospital, unconscious, prognosis uncertain. Adrian froze, the receiver heavy in his hand. Memories of his father surged. Stern lectures about success, the endless push to make something of yourself, the pride he once sought by buying things his father would admire. Their relationship had been distant, marked more by criticism than warmth. And now, in a sterile hospital bed, the man who had shaped so much of his old identity lay silent. Adrian sat at his father's side, staring at the pale, motionless face. Machines beeped steadily, tubes ran into his body. For the first time in years, Adrian felt the weight of powerlessness. The old Adrian would have run. He would have distracted himself with purchases, noise, anything to avoid this stillness. But there was no escape now. He whispered, barely audible, "I've changed, Dad. I don't know if you'd understand, but I had to let go of everything to find myself." His father did not respond. Only the machines answered. Over the next few days, Adrian was tested again and again. Doctors offered probabilities but no certainties. Family members argued over treatment decisions. Old wounds resurfaced. Guilt, resentment, fear. At one point, his sister snapped at him, accusing him of not caring enough because he wasn't visibly panicked. Adrian clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to defend himself. Instead, he breathed deeply.
When the storm of words passed, he simply said, "I care. I just refuse to let fear be my voice." She stared at him, then broke down crying. Adrian put an arm around her. His silence had spoken louder than defense. One night, after everyone else had gone home, Adrian sat alone by his father's bed. The stillness pressed against him, testing every ounce of his practice. He remembered Seneca's words that Daniel had once quoted, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." Adrian realized that whether his father woke or not, life was reminding him of its brevity. This was the final test, not to conquer loss, but to meet it with steadiness. He whispered again, "If you go, I will not crumble. If you stay, I will not cling. Either way, I am at peace. I hope you are too." For the first time in his life, he meant those words. Days later, his father opened his eyes, weak, frail, but alive. Adrian felt a rush of gratitude, not the desperate, clawing gratitude of someone spared from loss, but the calm recognition of a gift he had not expected. In that hospital room, he realized the philosophy had held. Even in the face of uncertainty, fear, and family pressure, he had remained anchored. This was the final test, and he had passed, not by conquering the storm, but by standing in it, unshaken. That night, in his journal, he wrote, "Life cannot be controlled, only met. Today, I met it, not with panic, but with presence. The final test is always the same, to accept what is, fully and without fear. And tonight, I did." He closed the journal and looked around the quiet hospital room. For the first time, he no longer felt like a man rebuilding from ashes. He felt like a man reborn.
The seasons had turned again. Adrian stood in his apartment, the same bare walls, the same wooden table, the same chair. A year ago, this emptiness had felt like defeat. Now, it felt like freedom. The fire had stripped him of everything he thought defined him, but in losing, he had found what could never burn: his mind, his choices, his peace. He brewed coffee and sat by the window. Morning sunlight poured across the floor. For a while, he said nothing, did nothing, just breathed. Silence had once been unbearable. Now it was his sanctuary. He thought of Daniel, of the evenings they'd spent in conversation, of the quotes that had at first sounded abstract, but had slowly become flesh in his life. He thought of his father, now recovering, their conversations fewer but gentler. He thought of Sarah, who had begun asking him about minimalism, curious if it might ease her own chaos. Adrian realized he had not only changed himself, quietly, without trying, he had begun to change others. Later that day, he walked to the park where he and Daniel had first spoken months ago. The same bench, the same stretch of sky. But Adrian was not the same man. He sat, watching children run through the grass, parents chatting, leaves drifting lazily on the breeze. Once, he would have scrolled through his phone, impatient, planning the next purchase or achievement. Now, he simply sat, present. He remembered something Epictetus had taught. Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. Adrian smiled faintly. He was free. Free not because he had everything, but because he no longer needed everything. That night, he opened his journal one last time. The circle is complete. I began with fire and ended with light. I lost what I thought I was, and in losing, found what I am. Possessions fade, applause dies, but character endures. Minimalism cleared the space,
Stoicism filled it with strength. Together, they gave me life. He closed the journal, slid it onto the shelf, and turned out the light. The room was silent, simple, and whole, and so was he.